My name is Susan Gerber-Burning, and I am the Interim Executive Director of the Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House, a historic house located in Alexandria, Virginia. We're home to two iconic properties. That's Woodlawn, a former plantation whose owner, Nellie Custis Lewis, who was a step-granddaughter of George Washington, and her husband enslaved over 90 people between 1805 and 1839. Also on the property is the Pope-Leighey House, which is why we're all here today. It's a mid-20th century house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. We are also home to the Arcadia Center for Sustainable Food and Agriculture, which provides quality food to food deserts here in the Washington, D.C. area. And that's all on the property. I'm glad that you all joined us for this presentation and discussion by Peter Christensen. And this is part of our speaker series that's celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Pope-Leighey House. You can access recordings of our previous speakers and experts on our website. And after this presentation, after Peter's presentation, give us about a week and a half to 2 weeks to get those links up. Zoom is fantastic, but it is a little awkward to get the editing and uploading and downloading ready. So give us a little time and we'll get those up for you. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to go over a few little items with you. During this part of the presentation, we'll keep your microphones muted and the cameras are off so that you can focus on Peter. And we'd like to also make you aware that this session is being recorded, and if your camera or microphone happens to be on, your image and voice may incidentally be shown as part of this call in future promotional materials. So for best viewing, let's all look at our screens, and we recommend that you change your screen to speaker view. And you can do this by clicking view at the top right of your screen and select side by side speakers. So take just a moment, select side by side, look at the top right of your screen and click view. You'll see it there. That'll make this viewing so much more pleasant for you. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat section. So look down at the bottom and you should see a chat button at the bottom of your screen. I will be facilitating your questions that you put into the chat section of the screen after the end of the presentation, and I will let Peter know what questions have come in. And now I'm really happy to introduce Peter Christensen. If you don't know him, Peter has been leading in-depth specialty tours of the Pope-Leighey House for 18 years. He is an essential part of the work that we do here. And as an expert volunteer, he leads some of the research, community programs, gathering of artifacts, education of guides, and presentations such as this. We're so lucky to have him among the Pope-Leighey House family. In addition to Frank Lloyd Wright, Peter has an interest in travel, genealogy, and produces exquisite woodwork. He has even created some of the furniture you can see at the Pope-Leighey House today. Peter, I am just so pleased to welcome you as our very special friend and partner and Pope-Leighey House expert. So Peter, we turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. This is going to be fun. I'm going to kind of start off talking a little bit how I got to Pope-Leighey and things I've done here on this first part of the tour. When I retired from the federal government, my wife decided that I needed something to do with my time. And since I happened to live between Mount Vernon and Woodlawn, we saw a small ad in the newspaper saying they were looking for some guides at Woodlawn. And I answered the ad and went in and talked to the folks, and it looked like a really interesting place. Of course, one of the really unusual things was they were a little bit old school at that time. So when I came in, we had the two properties, the Woodlawn Mansion and the Pope-Leighey House. Well, at that time, all the women who came in were sent to the Woodlawn Mansion, and all the men were sent to Pope-Leighey. And that's kind of how I ended up going to Pope-Leighey. They gave me a book and said, read a bit, and when you're ready to talk about it and give a practice tour, you can give a practice tour. Well, that was a little bit more complicated than I realized. And I also realized I needed a little bit more organization and structure to what I was doing. So one of the first things that I did was I created an outline for our tour. Now, one of the nice things about Woodlawn is that we don't have scripts. We have things we want to make sure we talk about, but we don't have a script that you have to read off of. And that makes it really nice because when you have different groups, you can have a different tour. I mean, I've done tours for the board of directors of the AIA, and that's a very different tour than I give to an 8th grade junior high school class. we've had some fun with this, and then it was successful enough with its outlines that we're now using it for our other guides, and when they come in and they go through their training process. But as part of what was going on, and some of the things I got into, is that it's really interesting. Just the more I got into Wright and the more I got into the design, trying to explain things. Then we had people coming through on tours. They would ask questions. Sometimes I would know the answers. Sometimes I'd have to do a little research. And the more I got into it, it's really fascinating stuff. I mean, the whole idea of creating space, and to me, that's really the whole real genius of Wright, is that he created absolutely fantastic integrated space that was very, very functional and very comfortable. At Pope-Leighey, we have three basic areas. We've got the private section, the bedrooms. We have a public section, the living room and the dining room and the kitchen. And then there's a mixed section, a little bit of a third area of semi-private area, an office, is what I call a sanctum. The other thing with Wright designs is that they're all laid out in grid patterns. All sorts of different shape grids. They've got squares, they've got rectangles, they've got hexagons, they've got circles. At Pope-Leighey, it's a 2 foot by 4 foot grid. And I know when I was giving the tour to the AIA directors, they were telling me that in the 1970s, they thought it would be interesting and to have a much nicer presentation if the blueprints that we're using didn't have a lot of dimensions on them. Well, that's exactly what Wright was doing. The problem was in the 1970s, none of the workmen who could follow those designs very well. That wasn't the case with the Wright folks. When the Howard Rickard, the carpenter who actually built the house, thought it was a wonderfully designed and very functional side. Then we also had all the really unique construction things that Wright was doing. I mean, there's so many things in this house that are precursors to what was happening in the country after World War II, the design elements, the attempt to get rid of load-bearing walls. Wright loved the use of cantilevers, and he was using those extensively. He was pioneering the use of underfloor heating. And then we have just a lot of prefab work. The carpentry work in the house actually is really pretty remarkable. That picture you see on the right-hand side that's what the walls look like. So they're less than 3 inches thick. Wright claimed they were fireproof. Obviously, he had a history of having problems with fires, and so there's no airspace. But look at the joinery. I mean, you've got tongue and groove, you've got shiplap, and on the top of it, there's a combination of miter joints and butt joints. I mean, it's a really intricate design, but it's really very functional. And it's designed to let wood, which is a living item, even after it's been cut, expand and contract and really work very nicely. But then as we got along, I got more experience and I got playing with more things. And so I started being involved in more different types of tours. Originally, we had a tour called the Tech Tour, which is we now have relabeled the In-Depth Tour. And we can spend 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday morning going through the house, going through some slides on the house. In fact, a lot of the slides we're going to go through later today will be types that we would use in this in-depth tour. And we'd have 2 or 3 guides be involved. And it was really a fun thing, and people really enjoyed it. And then over time, we've had other options happening. A couple of years ago, there were a number of novelizations of Wright's life. There was something called The Women or Loving Frank. And a friend of mine had a book club and said, you know, we'd like to see this Frank Lloyd Wright house, make reading the book a lot more interesting. And so over a bit of time, we developed a tour called the Book Club Tour. That really was a personal life about Wright and what was he going through and how his life went, to enrich their experience in their book club. And then a friend of mine who does tours for the Smithsonian Associates, we got discussing the idea that maybe we could do a combination tour where we go to Pope-Leighey and really show how he was a precursor to almost all the mid-century modern designs that were coming out. We have a couple of nice mid-century modern developments in this area, Holland Hills, just south of Alexandria City, and Homes on Acre out by the Inova Medical Center, both built in the early 1950s into the 60s. but clearly taking design elements that Wright was using. They're using open space plans, using lots of windows. They're integrating the properties into the landscape, making it much more amenable and really a really nice living environment. Oh, so we played with that and we developed that tour. One of the more unusual things is that we had the Voice of America Russian service come and wanted to do a video of the house. They apparently had done a video at the Falling Water, and they realized it was a Frank Lloyd Wright house near where their offices were in Washington, and they said, could they come out and do a tour? Well, they came out and did a video tour. They dubbed me in Russian, but what I found really interesting is they added this graphic to really illustrate the underfloor heating in the house. And we had never seen something like that, and I thought it was really original, but lots and lots of fun. And then the local tourist association in Fairfax County did another video where we talked about the house and play with that. But then the other things that's happened with the house is that during COVID, we had to figure out how to do tours in this small little house. Now we got a 1,200 square foot house with a really narrow hallway and fairly small bedrooms. Then it just didn't feel comfortable making a tour that you kind of squeezed all these people in. So we reduced the size of the tour. We called it the Inside Out Tour. And so we started out outside the house. We took them into the larger areas of the house. And then to show the rest of the house, we went back outside and opened the windows and let them look into the windows. And it actually was kind of fun. And we're going to continue those this year until we feel a little bit more comfortable with the COVID situation. But in addition to that, one of the things that I found in the house was that people often have trouble visualizing. Well, this is another thing, getting into the history of the house. Here we have Stuart Udall, the Secretary of the Interior, dedicating the relocation of the house. Now, what's really interesting is that when this house was relocated from its original site in Falls Church, it was less than 25 years old. It was being threatened by highway construction, and Udall got personally involved with saving this house. The trust itself wasn't really sure that, well, why would you be saving a house that wasn't really historical? Nobody famous really lived there. But Udall realized that this was an important part of our history and it should be saved. And what was really interesting is that part of the realization that they couldn't save it in its original location was part of the catalyst that got the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 out of Congress, or out of the committee, and voted for the full Congress. The loss of Penn Station and Pope-Leighey, what a contrast between those two places, but they played important roles in getting our Historic Preservation Act passed, and it's been a marvelous thing to help save properties. And then in addition to that, visualization. People had problems understanding things. We had the children's bedroom. It was really empty. There was no bed in it. The Popes had taken the beds that were in there. That was the only furniture that they took from the house. Everything else they left and sold to the Leighys when they sold the house to them. They had taken the children's bed in there, and people got confused. That somehow they see an empty room and they had problems figuring out what it was. Well, luckily we had the blueprints to the house, and the blueprints included the plans to the furniture. I started looking at the blueprints and said, it's not that hard. It's pretty straightforward. It's a simple construction. I've got a decent wood shop at home. Why don't I make a bed? Which is I did. So we made a bed following the pattern, and all of a sudden the children's bedroom looks a lot more like a bedroom. Kind of fun. Well, that kind of got me onto things, and I've got doing more and more of these types of things. We needed a nice bench that folks could rest in outside the house before its tour started. And then I took the pattern that we have for the chairs that are in the house, made them double wide, and then took the classic pattern of the cutout pattern windows we have in the clear stories and used it as a backrest. So we have a really interesting bed or bench in here. And we've got a second one that I built that at some point we're hoping to have an auction. We can auction that second bench off. And then lighting, especially in the early part of when I was doing tours, we were doing tours all the way through December. And after the time change, it got pretty dark, and the house was not really well lit. It was more ambient and lights that was pleasant but not really functional. Well, so I started looking around trying to figure out how can we bring some lights into the house. Well, I couldn't see anything that we wanted to buy that would actually fit, that would make sense in the house. But I found that Wright had designed a really interesting corner light called a Taliesin lamp. Usually it's seen as a floor lamp. But I took that design and recreated it and redimensioned it so it fit on the shelves in the living room, and we have an interesting corner lamp. Wright was also into having dried flower arrangements. He called them weeds, and he had weed holders, and he designed a number of different weed holder boxes that he would have his dried arrangements in. Well, in the children's bedroom, we needed a lamp in there. So I took that design for the weed holder and turned the weed holder into an upright lamp, and we have a little more bright light. And a similar thing for the sanctum. So I've been having some fun trying to build some things that are useful, taking Wright designs, sometimes modifying them a little bit, and bringing to the future. Well, that's pretty much the first part of my talk. At this point, I'd really, be happy to take any questions anybody has, and then we can start the second part. Susan?
I'm right here. So while Trinity is gathering those questions for us, Trinity, do you mind changing the screen so that it says presenter only rather than the presentation? And we can go ahead and just get our faces up here. But while Trinity's gathering the questions for me, I'd love to ask you something, Peter, about how this has changed you. So we see you here all the time. Peter puts together the most amazing tours, and at one point you offered us to come to lunch, sit down in that great place on the furnishings, the table that you had made, the chairs that you had made. It was exactly replicated to how it was when it was last left at the house, but when the Leighys left it. So how has this changed you? We can see how it changed us, but.
Well, one of the things is that I've obviously gotten into the house and enjoy getting people into the house and getting them excited about the house. And that's something that's really been a lot of fun for me. But the table was actually another interesting project. Ashley in her talk talked about the idea that she would love to get people to be able to stay in the house. I've got some concerns about that because some of the house is pretty delicate, and if it's actually really used, it could be somewhat a problem. But one of the things we have done is that we've had a couple of weddings in the house. We've had some weddings outside the house. And I was thinking that, well, maybe we should be able to have some dinners in the house. We've actually had 1 or 2 dinners in the house. But again, what are we going to use to have the dinners on? Well, thought about that a little bit, and the way we have the dining room set up in Pope-Leighey is that we have 3 tables that are independent, that are all linked together and hooked together with C-clamps. Well, I took that concept and essentially built a single table, the size of 3 tables, that we could put into the living room, pull the chairs that we have around the house into the space, and we can have a very safe place, but give you the feeling that you're using all the original information, all the original items. And I just found it great fun to play with this and think of how to make the presentation. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is most fun about doing the tours is thinking about, you're not just talking about the things, but you're telling a story. And the story can be in a number of different ways. I mean, you can live the story by having lunch there. I mean, it was great fun when we had the lunch. We had I think 8 of us at the table, and it was just really, really fun. And, now we have a lot of folks that come around touring. I like to joke that Frank Lloyd Wright aficionados are kind of like birds. They have a life list, and they're trying to go to every place they can go. Well, I've kind of done that myself. I've expanded a little bit. I mean, before COVID, the year before, expanded things like going to more mid-century modern things and seeing the relationship with Wright and trying to understand that and just really seeing how important he was. I mean, one of my favorite stories that I stumbled on when I was doing some research for one of the tours was that in 1937, Wright is building one of these Usonian homes on Long Island.
Peter,
Mhm.
Peter, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no,
Folks are telling us that they're having a difficult time hearing you. It's fuzzy. It's got a bit of a buzz to it. You might want to get closer to the speaker.
okay, let me,
Better.
is that better?
A little bit. Let's see.
A little
Try
bit?
it.
Okay, can you hear me a little better now?
I think we can.
Okay,
Good. Go
good.
ahead,
Yeah,
please.
probably not close enough. Okay, so I was saying that, 1937, Wright was building one of these Usonian homes on Long Island. And one of the questions we often get is that if Wright was so really interesting, why didn't he make thousands of houses? Well, part of the problem is he was too invested in the particular house and the particular location he was building. But this house he was building in Long Island, there was a young architect who was interested in what Wright was doing. He spent the summer watching Wright's house be built. And when he and his brother took over his father's construction firm on Long Island, they built Levittown and tens of thousands of houses. And those houses were so much more improved because they were taking concepts that Wright was pioneering: open space plans, slab floor construction, radiant floor heating, carports, and then dressing them up in more traditional facades. But the importance of that was really, really interesting. And stumbling upon that little story, I just found really fun.
So Peter, that I got most of what you're saying. So folks are saying that somehow the sound is still not clear. What we could do is say, how about slowing it down? A couple people can hear you fine, but
Okay.
others are not. So I'm going to ask everyone on the call to go down to the bottom right. I know you already have, but double check your. Yeah, it is fuzzy, Peter, but everybody raise your volume. And so Peter's going to slow down a little bit. These stories are so fascinating. We have lots of questions coming in, Peter.
Okay.
So go ahead, please. Or would you like another question?
Yeah, questions great. Let's do some questions.
Okay, good. So Peter, back off just a little bit on your mic. You know Zoom, it's just the joy and the bane of our existence. So
Right.
So let's see. Couple of questions. Let's see. Do you think that the designs that are embodied in the house and its furniture are still relevant today to environment and design? How do people come to this house, and how does it affect us even today, Peter?
So one of the fun things is that we get some folks who often say they don't really like modern design. But they come into the Pope-Leighey house and they realize that modern design can be warm. I mean, one of the things that Wright's doing is he's using warm materials, but he's connecting the house to the neighborhood, to the environment. And that's really a key to making us comfortable in our houses. Is that, we don't want to be isolated. It's not like a small little apartment that doesn't have any access. By connecting you to nature, you're bringing you back to your natural point where you really want to be. And I think that's such an important part of it. But people find the space amazing and they find it warm. And I think that's a really important part of what's going on with the house. Oh, I can't hear you.
That's because I'm on mute now.
Okay.
So very fascinating. So what Peter's saying is that it's getting at some misconceptions about what this style is, and that it's actually warm, and it's got so much warmth to it, and people are seeing that firsthand and able to take those warm concepts to current design. Okay, so let's see. We're going through the questions now and seeing, someone says, I toured the house when I was in school many years ago, and your tours sound so interesting, and I would love to take one again when it's safe to travel again. When do you typically do your tours?
Well, routinely in the past, I've always been there every Friday. And then I've done some other tours. But obviously with COVID, right now, as I understand it, our current plan is we're only doing tours on weekends. We're going to do Saturdays and Sundays. And they've got me booked for pretty much every other Saturday or Sunday for the near future. And hopefully that'll open up pretty soon. I know I've had my 2 vaccination shots, so I feel a little bit more comfortable. And I think things are going to start opening up pretty fast.
All right. And so in April, we'll be opening at the site to have tours, and then it's all COVID in consideration of COVID. So keep checking the website. We'll put that information up shortly. So another question, Peter, what was the original core board in the sandwich panels? My recollection is that it's something other than plywood that may have been considered.
Yeah, Wright's original concept is he wanted them to use cypress plywood because cypress was insect resistant. They couldn't find any cypress plywood to use, and the local contractor found a plywood variation called zero board that they were using. It's essentially a plywood. The problem is when they dismantled the house the first time, the outside and the inside wood, which is cypress, was wonderfully resistant to insects, but the core zero board was decimated by carpenter ants.
Wow. Wow. Interesting. Interesting. So that kind of goes right to the next question, which is, how is the house weathered? What kind of issues have you seen over the years? We've got carpenter ants, but okay, so what else has happened? And what about the windows specifically? Do the windows get replaced? What have you seen?
The windows are interesting. When the house was built originally, they were trying to save as much money as possible. So Warren Pope, the first owner, and the Gordon Chadwick, who was Wright's assistant, who was supervising construction, went around Washington and scavenged plate glass windows from office or commercial buildings that were being torn down. And they used this really cheap plate glass throughout the house. In fact, Warren Pope would tell stories that if it got really humid out, you could still see the writing that was left onto that they had scraped off the windows that they were using. Well, when the trust rebuilt the house, they obviously were concerned about it being a museum. They still wanted to keep single pane windows, which is what Wright was using, but they used tempered glass. So they've replaced all the glass that's in the house with modern safety glass.
Great, thank you. So it also kind of keeps pushing other questions. We've got some others coming in, but to that, do you think that the materials that you're describing are economical? Do you think that when people come to the house, that they can see themselves in this as a way of having a home that creates more equality for folks, that gives folks a design that they can be very proud of, that they have ideas on how to have an economical house and create more equality in housing and affordable housing? Do you think that's still happening today, as in when Frank Lloyd Wright designed the home?
One of my most favorite tours are young couples who are coming through the house trying to get ideas about what they want. And by the time they leave Pope-Leighey, what they want is maybe very, very different than what they thought they want when they walked in. It's kind of much like Warren Pope. He originally thought he was going to get a Cape Cod. He went to one of Wright's lectures and he became enamored with what Wright was doing. And all of a sudden he didn't want that Cape Cod. He wanted one of these modern, really imaginative houses that Wright was going to provide. And I think a lot of our visitors get exactly the same feeling when they come through the house.
Mm-hmm. They get excited about what can be, which is in part of the purpose of grand and great design, even though in this case it was for essentialism, minimalism. So, okay, another question.
I think Pope-Leighey is so important because it isn't a grand house. It's showing what people can do in real life and make it available to people. And I think that's really such an important part of what's going on and why it's so important that we have Pope-Leighey available as a site.
Now, can you expand on that just a little bit, on why that's so important to be able to have everyone see themselves in that and then potentially even recreate it for themselves? Tell us a little more.
One of the things that, again, I found is that a lot of folks have trouble visualizing. So until they come into the space and see how it can actually work, they don't really realize what they're missing. Like somebody says, we don't know what we don't know. Until you walk into the space and say, hold it, this isn't big space, but it's grand space. And that's really important to understand, that bigger isn't just necessarily better, but you can do it with good design. I mean, one of my favorite concepts when people are going out of the house is just, we talk about the idea that good design matters. And this is really, really good, clean design.
I would say in all the homes that I work in, historic sites, there are a lot of grand houses. And yet when you go to this Pope-Leighey house, you get the sense of grand space, exactly how you just said, Peter. So thank you for that. Okay, another question. Let's see. You mentioned that Wright's houses are designed for their site. So, but the
Yes.
Pope-Leighey house was designed for another site. And how well does it fit? How did you see this?
Let me put that question off because I've got something to answer it in the second part.
Okay, great. So do you think it's time to move on?
Let's move on. Let's move on. Let me see if I can get the other slide to show up.
Okay.
And let's see how, no. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so start off with the quote from Wright. His autobiography, he was constantly updating it. In this case, he's actually talking about, the house of moderate cost is really a significant problem to this country, and he's going to be the one that fixes it. He plays with that, and this really is the key to this whole Usonian concept. He talks about these principles that, people have to accept, and you have to accept a simpler lifestyle. I mean, you can't collect everything, but he's going to do things that are going to both simplify things. He's going to drop the price by making them less complicated, and he's going to give you really grand and wonderful things. But we've got one of the people that became enamored with Wright, and he went to one of his lectures almost by accident. He was sent there by his newspaper to listen to this talk, and this is Warren Pope and his wife, Charlotte. He went to the lecture thinking he was going to learn a little bit about what's going on, and all of a sudden he junked the plans that he had originally for a Cape Cod, and he wrote a 6-page letter with every blandishment he could think of for a man that he knew had a reasonable ego, and he played him up. It's like playing a violin. Well, what's really fun is that after that 6-page letter, he gets a 2-line response. Of course, I'm ready to give you a house. And then it worked from there. So what we've got, I'm going to go through a number of pictures and kind of talk about them. And I think at this point, when I get to a picture, if somebody has a question or something after I talk a little bit about it, we probably should stop and talk about it at that point. So now when Warren and Wright get together with a concept, Wright's initial idea is a 1,600 or an 1,800 square foot house, L-shaped, with 2 bedrooms. But it's determined by the Popes and Wright that it's going to be too expensive to build. The design, here's the layout. Those of you who are familiar with Pope-Leighey will see that that's the relationship. It's an L shape. But instead of having, it has the kitchen and the bathroom co-located together away from the bedrooms, whereas in Pope-Leighey it's connected. There's an office, which he calls a sanctum, but he had, in addition, having a workshop out here, and the utility room was off to the side. And then there was a very large screen patio that ran the whole length. Well, again, too expensive, couldn't afford that much. So this is what they ended up with. Basically the same L shape with 2 bedrooms. They put the utility room and the workspace kitchen together, but they moved the bathroom over adjacent to the master bedroom, so it's almost an ensuite. They got rid of the screen porch, and they got rid of the little workshop and just have this. Truthfully, I think this is a much more functional and more fluid design, and I think it's really one of the better Usonians. It just really works really, really nicely. And again, here you can see the 2-foot by 4-foot grid pattern that I talked about earlier. We have the plans, and again, the blueprints are fun. It's really interesting to see them and get a feeling for how simple the basic design is. It's really straightforward.
Peter, a quick question. Did Usonians typically have tiny kitchens, and did the original owners care about that? Did they cook much?
They did, but the kitchen is actually interesting. It's a 1-person kitchen. There's no question about that. In the Pope-Leighey house, the Lauren Pope was actually the cook of the house. For one person, the work triangle thing they have for kitchens, it's actually pretty functional. It works fairly well. Marjorie Leahy complained that it was a little hard to make a big meal for a big group, but you can work it out fairly well. Now, there's a similar house to this, to the Pope-Leighey house in Alabama, the Rosenbaum, and in that house, Wright actually came back and renovated the house, making it larger and making the kitchen much larger. So obviously there were some folks that were interested in having larger kitchens. We like to joke that we doubt if Wright ever boiled a cup of water. So he calls it the workspace. He doesn't call it the kitchen. But the other thing that's happened with the kitchen in that house to make it more pleasant is that it has the really tall ceilings and a wonderful slot window that make the space feel bigger than it really is, because it really is a small space. But the work triangle is efficient. So here we've got a picture. Our prior talk with Steve Reese, when he was managing an architectural firm, he had a intern that had a little extra time in his hands, and they made this absolutely wonderful model. Makes it a lot easier to understand the house. I talked about a honeycomb on the roof section, gives you a lightweight and strong design, lets the cantilevers hang out there. Really nice way to visualize the house. And then we have this plan drawn by Edgar Kaufman Jr., whose father had Fallingwater built. Edgar Jr. was the curator at the Museum of Modern Art for architecture. When we had the dedication after the house was moved, he actually came and spoke and thought this is one of the better Wright houses. But it's a nice drawing. You can see the way the hemicycle is set around the house. You see the location of the tulip poplar. You see all that interaction that makes the house so much interesting. Now, when Wright built houses in these days, he had the Taliesin Fellowship. It was kind of a cross between an architectural firm and a architectural college. Well, one of the new members of the Taliesin Fellowship was Gordon Chadwick, shown here. One of my favorite stories about Gordon is apparently when he first met Wright, Wright asked him what he's been doing lately. And he says, well, I just graduated from Princeton. And Wright says, oh, you just wasted 4 years. And Gordon's response was, well, that's where I heard about you. So these people could stand up for themselves. Gordon did a lot of interesting things. They had a lot of freedom to make innovations. He designed some of the things for the house. And after the house was finished, he got drafted into World War II, and he became one of the monuments men that went around Europe saving our cultural heritage. So the folks we have here are really pretty interesting. Now, Gordon came into Northern Virginia looking for somebody to build this house, and they couldn't find a regular contractor who was interested. They all wanted more money than it was worth. But he did find a man named Howard Rickert, who had a small workshop in Vienna, and he really wasn't a house builder. He was a cabinet maker. And when you start walking through this house, you start seeing the cabinet level work that is really being done. It's really pretty amazing. Lots of fun. And when they moved the house the first time, he actually came back and helped rebuild it. But some of the interesting design elements. We've got the underfloor heating. When the house was being built, the building inspectors didn't really trust the strength of the walls. So they piled bags of cement up on the roof and to see if it would stand up, and it held up. Again, kind of fun pictures from the early construction. Laying the foundation, again, in the first build. Slab floor constructions were unusual at the time. It was one of the things that Wright pioneered. There's a way he saved money. He got rid of basements, which he hated. He thought they were dark and dank. And in this house, he uses a utility room. He doesn't even put anything in the basement. And again, you build the walls, and then after you build the walls, you put the wood around it. Now, it's kind of interesting to think when they had to rebuild the house, they had to almost do it in the opposite. They didn't want to recut the wood. So when they redid it, they had to brace up the wood and build the masonry to fit the wood. Kind of unusual. This is a fun picture. Apparently, during the building of Falling Water, there were real concerns and problems with the strength of the cantilevers. And Edgar Kaufman actually hired some structural engineers to take a look at Wright's work and said, this is no way strong enough. These cantilevers aren't going to hold. And actually, they were proved right many years ago when Falling Water had to spend a lot of money reshoring up in really imaginative ways the cantilever roof section. Well, when Gordon Chadwick got to the house and we started building it, he and Lauren went out and scavenged a couple of pieces of steel that they snuck into the cantilever carport just to make sure that it was strong enough. And so we've got a little documentation that, and apparently Wright never found out about it. Kind of fun. So this is a picture Wright uses of the house in his book, The Natural House. And this is the approach he would have wanted to have. And we'll talk a little bit about what he actually ended up with. But this is how he wanted you to see the house, and this is how he expected it. Another picture of the house shortly after it was built, and you notice here that there's no screen porch, and that was put on by Gordon Chadwick shortly after the Pope moved into the house. It wasn't part of the original redesign of the house, but it was added by Gordon at the request of the Pope because they really liked the idea of having that screen porch that would have run the whole length. It just run outside by the kitchen, by the living room. Again, you can see by this time, and this is shortly after they moved in, at the original location in Falls Church, you can see the screen porch here, and you can see Lauren's Studebaker under the carport. Now, when the Pope moved in, obviously the house comes fully furnished. This is a whole, totally holistic design, but Charlotte Pope had a couple family pieces that they just moved into the house. And you can see how inappropriate those Victorian pieces are in the house. Well, apparently within 6 months, it looked like this. And they really did realize that they had to accept the idea that they had to have a simpler lifestyle and they had to clean up the look. Kind of fun seeing those two pictures one right after the other. Again, looking at the other direction, you see the carport, and you see the branches over this trellis outside the kitchen. It's covered with some branches to act as a diffuser for some light bulbs that right now we have as bare. We haven't quite figured out how to make them a little bit less obvious. And then you see the fireplace, well used, and again, and the rugs are in here just exactly like we have at Pope-Leighey today. Now, in 1946, a small ad is in the Washington Post. There's a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and they want $17,000 for it. In Steve's book, he talks about learning from Lauren, that they had 100 people sitting outside the house, really surprised, and they ended up selling it to Robert and Marjorie for the asking price. Largely because they really thought these people understood the house and they really cared about it. Now, it's interesting in that it was really Robert Leighey who was interested in modern architecture. Now, Robert was a patent attorney. They had temporarily been moved down the patent office to Richmond, and after the war, they brought them back up, and he wanted a modern house. Marjorie really wanted something more traditional, but she went along with it. And in the process, she fell in love with the house as well. So here's the house in Falls Church. Again, you can see it's part on the wooded hillside. It's all tied together. And there's one of the nice things that happened when they moved the house is that the National Park Service HABS unit, which is responsible for historic buildings, came back and they really did a good documentation. And there's a lot of great pictures. And if you've got some time, the Library of Congress website pretty much has all of those available to look at. But you can see how they planted bushes for privacy. You can see how the driveway comes up here right to the carport. And you get a sense of how the house is. But again, it's very much in that natural wooded environment.
Peter, this brings, there is a question that really seems to fit right here. And that is, when the house was moved, the orientation relative to the compass and the sun apparently changed. Given the importance of light, how do you think, what happened when it was reset into the Woodlawn?
Give me about 3 more slides and we'll get there.
Okay, great.
No, we're definitely going to talk about that because there was a little bit of confusion when Steve and Ashley were talking about how that worked. And actually, Steve did a really nice job in his book, and we'll talk about that. One thing interesting in the head, it documented that Robert Leahy had added a light to the kitchen. He didn't think there was enough light. Now, one of the things that is innovative of the house is that Wright used under cabinet lighting, which is really unusual in that pre-World War II period, but it gave a very functional light and that you didn't block when you were working it. But they essentially decided they needed a little extra light. We did not put that light back up when the house was moved. Again, a couple pictures of when just before the house was moved. This is a very sad picture. After the notice was given that they were going to condemn the house, Marjorie was tending to ignore it. Robert dies of cancer, or Robert dies, and this is a bedroom where there's two twin beds, and his bed has been removed. Again, kind of when you think about it in that nature, it's kind of really pretty sad. Fireplace. This is fun. When Wright came to visit the house right after it was constructed, he complained that this all was bright white firebrick, and it wasn't locked into the pattern of the bricks, and it was just going to really stand out like a sore thumb. And he told Gordon Chadwick to paint the brick. And Gordon said, well, we really don't have to paint the brick. As soon as we have a fire, it'll start to blacken. Well, when they rebuilt the house at Woodlawn, they left the fire brick visible, solid white. And when I got there, I started doing the research, and we had a wonderful oral histories that talked about Gordon and Wright conversing about what the fireplace should look like. We had these great historical pictures of the fireplace being blackened. And the director at the time just would not listen. He didn't want us doing anything like this. It was, I don't know what he thought we'd messed the house up. Well, he had some other problems, and when he was fired by the trust, I had the maintenance man at the time save a bag of soot that came from a problem furnace at Woodlawn. And the day that he left, I went down to Pope-Leighey and scrubbed the back of that wall with the soot, and we now have a dark space behind the fireplace, so it looks like it's actually being used. Again, something I couldn't resist doing. We got this wonderful picture of Marjorie. So she's signing over the house. I mean, does she look like a deer caught in the headlights? I mean, she's saying, what am I doing? But she really didn't have a choice. The house was condemned. And then she went on to Japan to be a teaching missionary for the Episcopal Church, and then came back after the house was rebuilt and moved back in. But when the house was moved, it gets really confusing when you talk about the house being moved. What really happens is the house got disassembled. Whole wall sections got taken down, taken apart. They got put onto a flatbed truck. They got driven to Woodlawn, and they reassembled it. And it's really, that's, I guess you could say it was moved, but it was really rebuilt. And then they had the dedication ceremony with Stuart Udall. And again, as I talked earlier, this is the president of the trust and Udall discussing it, but it really became apparent that they needed that legislation to protect historic structures. And it was one of the outcomes of being unable to save this house in its original location. Now, here are the pictures that Stephen had done in his book. Interestingly, the original concept that Wright had was you're going to come in from this side along the bedroom wing and go onto the carport. Well, because of an error in the way that the topographical map was presented to him, when Gordon Chadwick got to the space, they realized they couldn't build the house in that way. He ended up reorienting the house so the driveway came in from the other side of the carport. And the real connection to the house is to the land. The orientation is topical, not solely. There are windows all over this house, so that you're going to get some interesting sunlight coming in from almost any direction. Well, when they moved the house to Woodlawn for the first time, they said, wouldn't it be interesting to make the approach the way Wright really had originally planned? So they had the house oriented to fit the site, but then had the driveway coming over here. Well, one of the problems with that is that right here, there's a great big hill, And as you drove over, all you really saw was the roof of the house, which is something that Wright never would have wanted. So when the house was relocated the second time, they went back to the original as-built approach, and this is how it's set. So you see those different orientations, but the key is the orientation of the house is topographical, it's not solar. Now, Marjorie complained vociferously about that because the sun was coming in different places than she was used to. One of the fun things that I learned when I first came to the house is that I could turn this house into a solar calendar. I could mark on the walls what day and time the pattern on the walls would start to show up. And they've got the wonderful patterns from the cutout windows. Well, Marjorie was upset because those patterns weren't coming in the same place that they were. It wasn't really wrong, but it was different. Does that kind of answer the question about orientation?
I think that did.
Yeah,
One question, Peter, one other question that tag teams on that. Did Frank Lloyd Wright object to the house being moved to a new location?
Well, he was dead by that time.
That's true. There you go. I think we all just realized that at the same time.
So yeah, he didn't have anything to say about it. But I mean, he wasn't a great advocate of saving things. He was always, it's like so many architects. His favorite project is what he's thinking about doing in the future. There's others of us that really appreciate how important what was there and really why it needs to be saved. So it's an interesting issue on that. So this is what the approach looked like in the first build at Woodlawn. You come over the hill, and then you come down the hill, and then you approach and you drive into the driveway. Some really big trees were left on the hillside. And again, coming down, and just beyond this picture is where the hillside, where you would have seen the cover. And then again, some more pictures. And you drive up and you park the car here. Another picture of the first build. I'm not sure how anybody let Marjorie do it. She actually planted a wisteria plant here, which are really notorious for pulling down trellises. So I mean, it would have been scary about that cantilever overhang with a fully grown wisteria. We did not plant a new one there when the house was rebuilt the second time. But Marjorie was a real gardener, and you can still see the remnants of some of the plants she's planted. If you go down the hillside, you see some daffodils or some mahonia or some irises that are still there that Marjorie planted that many years ago. Really kind of interesting. And here's a picture of Marjorie of 1982, the year before she died. As I said, she went to Japan as a teaching missionary and taught English. And in 1982, one of her ex-students came back to visit. And luckily for me, a number of years ago, that same student came back to look at the house, and she had all these wonderful pictures of Marjorie living in the house in 1982. So we actually get to see what Marjorie looked like later and what some of the things that were done to the house. Here's her car under the carport, really kind of fun. But strange, we've got this really interesting picture, is they put a air conditioner in the cutout pattern window. Luckily, when the house was rebuilt, they figured out a way to put some air conditioning vents in the floor, so we have air conditioning and we don't have to intrude with this rather strange looking air conditioner in the wall. Again, another picture of that, and you can see how she used the branches as dried arrangements to act as diffusers over the entrance to the kitchen. Again, another air conditioner was put into the window to the master bedroom. Again, interesting ways of adapting the house to the realization that people wanted a little more comfort. Here's Marjorie visiting the docents up at Woodlawn. This was her social hour. She went up to collect her mail, and she got to chat with all the ladies, and the ladies all loved to chat with her, and lots of fun. But one of the things they didn't understand when they moved the house here the first time is that Fairfax County has a lot of something called marine clay. It's a really nasty product. When it gets wet, it expands. When it dries, it shrinks. This is a map of deposits And you can see I've put right where Pope-Leighey is, and it's in the major deposit of marine clay. Well, I like to describe it as it was almost as if you would put the house on top of an accordion and started playing it. Within 10 years of the house being built, there were major cracks in floors, walls were starting to separate, and it was realized that they had to take the house apart a second time. So the house was dismantled a second time, this time actually more completely. And the firm of Quinn Evans was hired to come and rebuild the house. You can see how it really is pretty close to its first location. It's only 30 feet or so up the hill. They excavated the hill. They took all the nasty soil out. They stabilized it, and they rebuilt the house, as which you're going to see today. But the house that cost $7,000 to build in 1940 cost about $750,000 to relocate about 30 feet in 1996. So it was not a cheap thing, but we're very happy that they did that. Again, some more pictures. I've just recently got a whole series of these pictures. It's really kind of fun to see how the house was rebuilt on the current site. After it was rebuilt, Lauren Pope kept coming back. I remember one time he came up, and he was the only person who was allowed to drive his car up to the carport anymore. But he had this great big Jaguar that he would drive up, and he would come to the house and he would give talks to the docents. It was really fun. He'd been giving his talk about the house so many times that it was really a script, and he played it really tightly. Well, the guys were always trying to get him off script and tell real stories about what he can do about the house and how things were done. One of my favorite stories of his off script things is that when he lost the wood shop in the first design, he said he ended up having a table saw in the sanctum. And for a while, he had both a table saw and a crib in the sanctum. And I never did ask him whether he used them both at the same time. But obviously, current Child Protective Services would not be happy with that. So this is what the house looks like in the second site. You can see the approach as you can drive up. You can see the bench that we replaced, but you can see, the graying and the different colors that are going on with the house. And we had some weathering that we were uncomfortable with. So a couple of years ago, we decided that we really did need to do a major job and clean up the house and do that. So the trust invested a lot of effort in getting some wood conservators to figure out how to gently clean the wood, and then reseal it to protect it. The house is 80 years old, and the idea that you can put wood out for 80 years is really pretty stretching it a little bit. And so we turned it from just a simple little ephemeral house into a real museum. And you really want to figure out ways to protect it. And it was nice the trust was able to do that. And you can see the progression. So today, you see this wonderful cypress wood on the outside that's been cleaned, and it was getting some wear that we were able to protect. So you see that going on. And that was, again, an important part of the conservation and preservation of the house that the trust has been very good about doing. Ashley Wilson, the architect, we've worked with her a lot to make sure that the house is well maintained. Again, some more pictures of the house after it was cleaned. And this is from Preservation Magazine. Matter of fact, if you're interested in knowing about the techniques that was going on and the preservation techniques, the Preservation Magazine is still available online, and you can just go up National Trust Preservation Magazine. It's a 2017 issue, but that's still available. You can read about all the technical details, the chemicals, and how it was done. Really, again, some more pictures of the house. This is cleaned up, really pretty. Inside, the wood is amazingly good. I mean, I think we put some wax on the walls 15 years ago. I mean, pretty minimal maintenance on the inside. Again, that's one of the nice things about having no paint or plaster in the house. It's easy to take care of. And again, you get that openness, that connected to the world outside. There's the fireplace that I blackened. It looks a little bit more like it's been used. Couldn't resist doing that. The kitchen, again, we talked about the kitchen. It's a small kitchen, but as you can kind of gather, the work triangle thing is really pretty good. It's functional. But the other key is this wonderful slot window. It just gives you a sense that it's not claustrophobic. And right outside that kitchen window, there's a little herb garden. You can just reach out and use some of the herbs fresh from your little herb garden. Again, the children's bedroom with the bed. And some of my favorite pictures are at twilight. And when the house is lit up from the inside at twilight, it looks like a Japanese lantern. And I love these pictures. We've been doing a couple twilight and tipple programs before COVID, where you can come in the evening and have some wine outside the house. And it's just a great way to see the house. And I really hope
Peter, we'll be doing 10 of those this year. So watch for them coming quickly.
Yes.
Trinity's putting those together.
It's a really wonderful way to see the house. It's a little more relaxed. And we have some guides here so you can walk through a little more casually. But that's pretty much what I was wanting to talk about. I mean, I can ask, answer some more questions. But other than that, we've got, the inside out, and then we can't help but resist the corner door. I mean, the really dramatic thing. I mean, pretty much everybody, this is the ultimate ooh and ah moment when you do your tour, and all the guides love to do it. They spring the doors open, and all of a sudden there's no corner. And then you can just kind of drift outside, and all of a sudden our visitors are drifting outside. You almost can't help yourself. It really does draw you out. It becomes such an important part of what's going on with the house. And that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about.
Well, Peter, this was absolutely perfect. And we want to thank you so much for joining us, Peter. It was a wonderful presentation. We're going to send you the questions that remain, and then folks you can get back to them directly. And yes, and you're sharing two masteries, both yours and Frank Lloyd Wright's, and we just can't thank you enough. And we're so thrilled with the intimate and firsthand pictures and the insights that you brought to us. And for all of you that are on the call, we were just also thrilled that you were here with us today. The DMV area, Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan, California, Seattle, New Jersey, Arizona, Georgia, England, and more. And Chicago, we're really sorry about your snow tomorrow, but perhaps after Peter's presentation, you're feeling just all the more warmer, so that'll help.